Our next speaker is Gerald Wang from MIT. He's in the field of mechanical engineering, and I'm going to massacre your advisor's last name. His advisor is Nicholas Haji Constantu? No.
That's fantastic.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yes, it's a lot of syllables. And his practicum was at Argonne National Laboratory.
So thank you guys very much for being here. I'm very excited to share with all of you some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last 4 years at MIT with Professor Nicholas Hadjiconstantinou. It took me quite a number of semesters to get that down. The title of this work is Engineering the Relationship Between Fluid Structure and Transport under Nanoconfinement. And I wanted to begin by talking about some of the motivations for this work. I believe that some of the most pressing problems we face today are problems of dirty energy, of dirty water. We really want to find new ways to bring us to a world of more clean energy and scenarios where we can provide more clean drinking water to people all around the world. Now, the common thread that ties these kinds of problems together is that we're always looking for new ways to do better filtration and better separation, or more generally, we want to find new ways to tailor and engineer fluid transport. There's many ways you can try to tailor fluid transport. The perspective that I like to take is a nanoscale perspective. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to think very big by thinking very, very small, thinking about the atomistic details of fluid-solid systems and how we can vary them to get better fluid transport properties. In order to do this, high-performance computing plays a very important role in my research, in particular in the form of molecular dynamics, or MD simulations. MD simulations are a way to resolve a nanoscale system with fully atomistic detail. In brief, the concept of molecular dynamic simulations is that you resolve a system out in all of its atom positions and velocities, and using information about how atoms interact with each other, you time evolve the system by numerically integrating Newton's equations, and that allows you to learn a lot about these systems' equilibrium and transport properties. Now, over the last approximately 20 years, MD simulations and a range of experiments have shown that fluids under nanoscale confinement have some really amazing properties. Some of these properties include very fast and selective transport. What I'm showing here is a nanoporous graphene membrane separating water from salt ions, so that's very useful for potential desalination technologies. Fluids under nanoscale confinement can also exhibit remarkable sensitivity to the transport of individual species in these small geometries, even when those species are at very low concentration, so that's very useful for chemical sensing. Fluids under nanoscale confinement also exhibit very interesting transport properties at the solid interface. What I'm showing here is the interfacial thermal resistance between a solid and a liquid, and what you can see is that that property, that material property, depends a lot on the density of the liquid at that interface. So there's a lot of possibility to tune this and tune the heat transport properties. This smorgasbord of engineering applications has, unsurprisingly, driven a lot of interest in nanoconfined fluids in the broader scientific community. But since we're sitting about a half hour out from lunch, I think I'm going to try not so much to appeal to your guys' sense of science, but rather to your sense of stomach. My goal over the next 10 minutes is to convince you that there's a profound analogy between nanoconfined fluids and cake. So here we go. This is the technical title of the talk, but the real operational title of the talk is How to Bake a Nanoscale Tiramisu. This is going to take 2 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about the structure of a nanoconfined fluid, and then we're going to use that information about structure in order to learn something about how these fluids transport and how we can tailor that transport. We'll begin with the structure. The first observation is that in these nanoconfined fluid systems, the solid plays a very important role. In particular, because the solid is quite rigid compared to the fluid, it can serve as a template for local structure. It can induce ordering in a fluid that is in many ways kind of like the solid itself. Just like a cake pan serves as a template or a mold for the fluid that goes into it, when you put fluid in a very small cake pan, like a carbon nanotube shown on the right, you can get structures that emerge in the fluid. The structures that I want to draw your attention to here look like concentric rings of fluid that form near the carbon nanotube wall. This layered structure is very pronounced when you look at a picture like this, which is fluid seemingly stacked in layers at a graphene interface. If we were to look at this layering phenomenon on a plot of the density as you move away from the interface, layers manifest as peaks in a density profile. What you can see here is one peak at some distance away from the interface, and this corresponds to locally some inhomogeneity in the density. Of course, you can adjust the system parameters. You can adjust the density and the temperature. As you lower the temperature, you'll tend to freeze this shape in and make this inhomogeneity even more pronounced. As you vary the system density, you can get even more and more pronounced peaks. In such a situation, at high density and low temperature, you have some very pronounced fluid layering at that interface. On all of these curves, there are a couple properties in common that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is this quantity that I'll call Zmin. This is the minimum distance between the solid interface and the onset of fluid layering. There's another length scale that I'll call HFL, the height or the width of the first fluid layer. And if you count the mass of fluid underneath each of these peaks, you can get a quantity that I'll call sigma FL, which is a surface or areal density of fluid molecules in that first fluid layer. It turns out quantities like these really control the anomalous transport at the fluid-solid interface. In order to make sense of these quantities, I like to use tools that are drawn from molecular mechanics and statistical physics. I think of these as the flour and the butter of my work, with simulations and high-performance computing being the eggs that really help bind everything together. We can walk through some examples. The first one I want to talk about is this quantity Zmin. It's called out here in orange for that carbon nanotube system. You can see that distance between the wall and the onset of fluid layering. If we try to think about and model layering in a system of a confined Lennard-Jones fluid, which is a fluid where the interactions are primarily van der Waals forces, you can work out an expression using mean field theory for the average effect that a fluid particle sitting inside of the carbon nanotube feels as a consequence of all the environment around it. It's kind of messy, but what's really cool is that you can do it analytically and get a closed form expression. This expression you could then attempt to analytically approximate its solution. You could numerically solve it, or you could run MD simulations and empirically observe what that standoff distance is. What's really neat is that all three of these techniques, when you use them, produce results that are very close to each other, and in fact all very closely match with what is observed in experiments that probe this quantity. So that's a neat example of how we can use information about the molecular mechanics of a system and get some predictions about structural features. We can also think about those quantities HFL and sigma FL. Now these are a little bit more complicated, and so to get some insight on these, we have to do what any great baker would do, and that is start from scratch. In particular, if we start from the steady Nernst-Planck equation, which is an advection diffusion equation that on the one hand relates diffusion that tends to spread a fluid out randomly, and on the other hand has advection that tends to drive fluid to structure in a way based on the external potential gradient, we can rearrange this in the context of a nanoconfined fluid-solid system, and in so doing, we'll identify a dimensionless group called the wall number, as well as this small parameter epsilon. We can do some more massaging on this to get an equation that governs the evolution of density inhomogeneities. And from this, as we keep working out, we can actually get some real hard quantitative predictions about how those quantities sigma FL and HFL depend on the system parameters. What I'm showing you here is some of the results of that analysis when you work it out. This Nernst-Planck theory predicts that that quantity HFL depends very intimately on the fluid density, and that quantity sigma FL depends quite a bit on the dimensionless temperature of the system, which is a function of the temperature and also the fluid-solid interaction strength. These conclusions would not be surprising to any seasoned bakers in the room, that the structure of a cake depends a lot on the density of the batter and the temperature of the oven and how sticky the pan is. But what's really cool is from first principles, we've shown that that's also true for these nanoscale cakes. In fact, what's really cool and may be kind of news to people who are just bakers is that there's a kind of universal recipe for fluid layering at a solid interface. If you take that areal density or surface density sigma FL and you normalize it against the intrinsic length scale of that first fluid layer, and you take that quantity, which is a volumetric density, and normalize it against the far field fluid density, you get this dimensionless quantity that I'll call a density enhancement. It reflects how much more peaked density is near the solid than it is far away. And it turns out for a broad range of systems, this quantity, the density enhancement, collapses onto a single universal curve independent of density, and it is a function only of temperature. So you can think of this universal scaling relation as a universal recipe for tailoring fluid aggregation at a solid interface. What's very cool is what you observe in MD simulations. matches quite nicely with what you would predict this scaling relation would be from the Nernst-Planck theory. So now we have our cake. The logical next question is, can we eat it too? How can we get some really, really delicious transport results out of this knowledge of fluid structure? Well, one example that we can do right away is trying to use information about structure as a new ingredient in understanding and doing flow modeling in carbon nanotubes. What I'm showing on the left here is that same fluid confined within a carbon nanotube system again. And on the right, what I'm showing is the relative density of fluid absorbed within the CNT as a function of the confining length scale. Because we know about the anomalous length scales and density scales associated with layering, we can make predictions about how density varies with the confining length scale. In general, because there is that distance z min, that excluded volume, the densities that you measure under confinement tend to be lower than the densities that you would measure in a bulk system. It turns out that the values that you get from MD simulation agree very nicely with what the theory would predict. And in general, this predicts that you can have a very large density anomaly when your system is very small. We can take that information then and try to do some modeling for nanofluidic devices and solve some problems that used to be very challenging to solve and which make a whole lot more sense in light of this picture. If we try to do modeling for this system that some people might call a nanoscale convergent nozzle, but I'll call a nanoscale frosting tip, it's formed by the junction of two nanotubes of different radii, and use this for nanofluidic flow control in order to adjust a downstream velocity. Your goal is to understand how that downstream velocity depends on the upstream velocity and the two nanotube radii. Macroscopically, that's a very simple problem of mass conservation, but microscopically, it's actually quite challenging to do this modeling, and when you use macroscopic approaches, you tend to get very large errors in predictions of the downstream flow rate, especially when the upstream nanotube is very large and the downstream nanotube is small. If you adjust these models for the fact that there is a length scale dependent density, you can get predictions for the flow enhancement upstream to downstream that are about an order of magnitude less. So that's kind of a neat example. Another transport example where knowledge of the fluid structure really, really helps is this case where we tried to study diffusion under confinement. Diffusion is a very important transport process. We don't, however, at the macro scale usually think of diffusion varying wildly with space. But under nanoscale confinement, it turns out that diffusion, mean squared displacement taken in ratio to the time, depends a lot on what region you're looking at. It depends on whether you look in this first layer region near a solid interface, or if you look far away, or as engineers tend to look at diffusion in such a system, what is the overall diffusivity regardless of whether fluid sits near an interface or not close to an interface. It turns out that fluid that sits near an interface diffuses in a way that's profoundly different from fluid in the bulk, and this has a lot of engineering implications. What I'm showing here on the left is the fluid atoms that are near the wall at time t equals 0 in a simulation. As time evolves, these gradually move away. However, this process is very slow, and eventually they're able to escape, at which point they can diffuse more freely. But what's critical here is that there's quite a long period of time where they're confined almost two-dimensionally, and their diffusive dynamics are very different than in the bulk. What's very cool is that through some statistical physical tools, we can actually model how much slower fluid particles near the wall diffuse as compared to fluid particles in the bulk. And using that information about how much slower that is, which is what I'm showing on the left here, it turns out that things in the first layer diffuse a lot very differently from the bulk at low non-dimensional temperatures. We can feed this into a bigger model for the overall diffusivity ratio, and we can make very nice predictions as a function of the channel width and the wall number, just how much the overall diffusivity is affected as compared to the bulk diffusivity using all these ingredients that we've cooked up earlier. So the technical details in here are a little dry, but I think the end result is pretty sweet. We can do a lot of very cool transport modeling by having this knowledge of fluid structure under confinement. I wanted to close by saying that I'm very, very grateful to the CSGF and all the folks at the Krell Institute and DOE for administering this program and offering this really tremendous opportunity. I feel very glad to have been a part of this community. I am especially thankful for how much academic freedom the CSGF enables, which many of the speakers today have already talked about. This is work that I've done. This work that I've just talked about sits mostly in this upper right-hand quadrant, but the CSGF has really given me the chance to think over a large number of computational methods and also a wide range of very, very small timescales. I also wanted to say very briefly that I think the benefits of the National Lab Practicum are tremendous, and I'm very grateful to have had that experience. It's very cool, especially for folks who haven't done a practicum yet. It really is a great chance to try a career track that's not the same as just pure academia. It's very helpful for applying for computational resources in the future, which has been very helpful for me. And it's also a way that you can meet some Hollywood celebrities, which was my experience. If any of you are a fan of the show Breaking Bad, you know that Bryan Cranston plays Walter White, but there's also this other almost equally important character, Bogdan, who runs the car wash that Walter works at. It turns out that Bogdan is a computational materials scientist at Argonne National Lab, which is where I did my practicum in summer 2015. And in fact, I met him at a computational methods seminar. So it really opened a lot of doors for me, and for that I'm very, very appreciative. With that, I'd like to thank everybody who's involved with this work, and thank all of you for your attention, and I'd be very happy now to take any questions.